Hello, welcome to this Unreal Engine study. I'm the Festmaster, and today we're going to be taking a look at a dialogue project that I did. This project was for a class, but I decided to show it to you anyway. It's much more completed than most of the other things I've shown, so I'll just demonstrate it here. It's a third-person thing where you can come up and talk to people, and they have dialogue and buttons that you can click. Then you can talk to more people, more buttons, different options, whatnot, including a system that keeps track of how many times you've pressed it. See, this will only allow me to have options once I've talked to both of the characters. So let's take a look at how this works. And to begin with, we'll look at the modifications I made to the third-person character. First of all, I stripped it down to the bare bones. Mouse, jump, I don't even need this touch input, and then simple movement. The next thing that I did was I added this detector volume here. It's equal in size to the regular capsule component, and its collision is overlap all dynamic. Where's the event graph? And so basically, when I have another actor overlap that, it checks to see if that actor does implement a specific interface, which is right here, just has an interact and event, and the single input is called player, and it's a third-person object reference. So that is the interactable interface that I used. I checked to see if there is. So on begin overlap, if we don't have a current interactable, which is just an actor reference, we check to see if the other actor overlapping does implement this interface, and if it does, we set that to be the current interactable. And when something ends overlap, if we do have a current interactable, and it is the thing that just stopped overlapping, we will reset current interactable to nothing. And this way, if you have two interactables that can be both overlapped at the same time, only one of them will ever be chosen, and it's the first one that overlaps, not a random one or the second one or anything. And then I also have the HUD being set up, just a get my player controller, and then I set that to a variable so I can use it later, and then I create my HUD, set that to a variable so I can use it later, and add it to the viewport. The next thing that I did here is an input action that I bound. Let me go to the edit project settings. And if we go to input, under action mappings, I have this interact button. It's just set to E. If we do have a valid current interactable, we will call the interact interface on it. And then finally, I have a start and end dialog system. And at this point, I should mention that I used the not yet dialog plugin to help drive this dialog. So I made two custom events, dialog end and dialog start. And then I just have a little boolean on the dialog end from error, which I use to help debug. And if it true, it just prints out the dialog ended from error, but other than that, it doesn't do anything. I disable the mouse cursor and set my input mode to game only, using that my controller variable that I set earlier when setting up the HUD. Then on dialog start, I actually have a DLG dialog object reference called dialog, and I check to make sure that is valid. Then I'll just pop one of these down here so it's easier to see where it's going. And then I enable the mouse cursor if this dialog is successful in starting. If it fails, I just say it failed, because, or not if it's successful in starting, if it is not a valid object. And then I set my input mode to be UI only and put the HUD in focus. And then I get myself and that current interactable, I make an array of them and use them as the participants in a begin dialog node, which targets the HUD. And so that should take us into the HUD. where we can look at the begin dialogue and what happens. We get our participants and dialogue list, and the first thing I do is just filter these participants. The filter participants is a small function that I made that it basically loops through all of the participants it's given and removes any from this list and sends out a new list, which is a local variable. Let's see, under here, local variables, there's new list of the dialogue participants that are actually participating in this dialogue. And then I'll actually start dialogue, which is provided by the not yet dialogue system. And then I make sure that this dialogue context object reference, which is what it returns, is valid. If it isn't, the dialogue failed to begin, and I end the dialogue for the in the HUD, or this is in the third person character, but I run the end dialogue so that you gain mouse control over your character again. And then if it is success, I set that to a variable, and I set a boolean to say whether we are in dialogue. And then I make a quick 4-dimension or 4-unit long array for this variable I have called button is quit, which I will get into later, and then I update the dialogue. This is where most of the magic happens. This is what displays the dialogue on the screen. And to go into the designer mode real quick, we'll notice that I have, that is not what I want. I have a large border called the dialog box, and then, yes, that is a border, and then I have a quick horizontal box in it because I did for some reason. I don't remember why. I may have had a picture or something. Then I have just another border. I could probably have condensed that, and then I have a vertical box for ordering all these things. I have a text box here for the speaker name, but the code that I wrote to display the speaker name did not work. So, oh well. Then I have a scroll box for the text so that you can scroll through text if there's too much for it, and then a text block for that actual text, which will auto wrap. Then I have another vertical box for all the buttons. Then I have button 1 with a size box on it and a text box, button 2 with a size box and a text box, and the same down. So back in our graph, first I make sure that current dialogue, which is the dialogue context object reference you get when you return a start dialogue, is valid. If it isn't valid, I just set that we are not in dialogue, run the dialogue, end. And then I will set the main text on the screen from that. And this is that code that I mentioned that doesn't work, setting the name of the speaker. I did not figure that out. And then I collapse all of those response buttons. The next thing that I do is I basically set up a loop that goes from 0 to maximum the number of responses. They're -1 or 3 if there are more than 4 responses, because this is essentially a array length. So this, if there are 4 responses, this will return 4, but I need my array to go from 0 to 3 if there are 4 responses, and so that's why I wrote this simple piece of code here. And then in this loop, this will only loop through valid ones. So if there are only 2 responses, this will run twice. Then so I can set the button to be visible and undo the collapse. And then I set the text on the buttons. And the way I'm getting each of the buttons and the text is I just use a make array with each of the buttons just manually plugged into it, and then I use these array to get from that. I set the text on it using this. So this is coming from my dialog context object, and then I get the option index, and I use that to get the text. And so what I do is if this text is equal to next, which is the default text for a option, then I just set it to 3 dots. And if the text is equal to finish, which is the default option for a option that returns to a quit, which we'll see when we go look at some of the dialog assets, I make it say bye. And that just basically allows us to set some custom text for those two options, and then I set the text. I also use this if it says finish to determine that the button is used for quitting. So all text that is used to quit has to have finish. There may be a better way to do this, but this is the way that I did it. And then I just set the array element of this button is quit array to the index based upon this to be true, because it is a quit button. So now it might be a good idea to just take a quick look at how my NCPs work. So the first thing that I have is they have this event interact, and they just start a dialog, which is a variable that they have, and it is called, it's just a dialog reference, and then they have a log destruction, which basically once you call this, 5 seconds later the act destroys itself. Now I do have a couple interfaces that I believe I overrode, and let me open them here. Well, apparently I didn't do Boolean. So I made a couple interfaces, and these are actually quite messy because I was in a hurry when I made them. But what these do, if I can sort this out, is these are called by the dialog system in certain cases, which I will explain in a moment, and they return a name, this thing called delta, and a value. It's the same for the float. These two work essentially identical. This is handed to a participant in the dialog. So these classes, they have to have two that is the class settings. They have to have two interfaces: the interactable one I made, and the DLG dialog participant, which allows them to be a dialog participant. But anyway, this allows me to modify an integer, and I've just set it up so that I have a map of names to integers, so that it's basically a special list of variables that are integers that I can use in the dialog. I have another one for floats. And so basically, if this name is a valid integer, I can set that particular map to be that value. And then my get is the same. If it is there, it'll return it. If not, it just returns a 0. The same works with the floats. And now that's the main thing. There is another event, so that's the main thing for the NCPs. There is one more thing on dialog event. If that event name is killchar, all caps, it'll log a destruction. So this is only used once in it. I only used that once. So now would be a good time to actually look over some of the dialog. The dialog is a dialog tree with a number of nodes. You've got like a start node here, a dialog node, a select node, and then transfers that have different rules. So for example, we'll just look at this one here. Now I have an enter event for that, which is something that'll happen when the dialog enters this, and it will modify an integer in the participant that is named Ninareth that is called spoken times and set it to 1. And the way I've done it is if I check delta, and we can look at this in my NCP, if I have checked delta, which is controlled by this variable here, it will, if this is false, it will just set the value to be that. If it is true, it'll add the value to the current value stored at whatever name. And so what is this? Takes the value stored at spoken names and adds 1 to it, or spoken times, I'm sorry, and adds 1 to it. And then the other thing I did is some of these rules for like this condition here, it has a strong condition, which means this has to return true, and it'll check this, that this other participant called Herefure, his last spoke must not be equal to 1. If it is equal to 1, then it'll basically shoot the dialogue over here and then end. This is a end node, and if you notice, the text on this particular transfer is finish. Some of these transfers do not have text, being the ones that leave a selector. However, ones that leave a dialogue do have text, which can be set, and these will become the options on the buttons. Meanwhile, the text set here is the main text of the screen. And so all of these, I have different events that they're doing to control basically what happens when you speak to different characters. These characters, the main character sort of has an alignment of which of the two main characters that he's kind of leaning towards their opinion, and the other, and they will both change what they're gonna say depending upon that, as well as the first time they talk to you, they will have a different set of things they say rather than every other time. And so that's mainly how the dialogue works. It's just a tree of nodes talking, or it's a tree of nodes and connectors that make up this dialogue. And so if we go back and play it, we will see that. I come up to him, I'll press E, it runs that interact function, and now it's made this visible, and the narrator says, and this is just a next, so it's corrected it to 3 dots, displays the text, it's just another next, and so on, and then there's a finish, it says bye. And then we'll notice that he disappears because that one particularly calls that destroy or kill character event. So there are a couple more things. In the character, I have these get participant names that the NCPs have these as well. They just return the name of the participant. If we go into the where is it? Get participant name, I actually have a variable for this in the NPC, or so that you can change this per instance. The characters is set. Again, I have these modify float and int values, and then another on dialogue event for quitting the game. And that's controlled by the event being called endgame. So that is the main part of how the dialogue is working. If we go to our event graph, we can see that for event construct, I just basically get the player, and then for these buttons being clicked, I just have a macro for that takes an index. So the first thing that happens is I make sure that we're in a valid dialogue state. So if we are in a dialogue and that dialogue is valid, we check to see if this is a quit button. If that is true, I end the dialogue. If it is not a quit button, I choose this button index as the next child dialogue and then update the dialogue, which we ran through that function already. If we are not in a valid dialogue, we end the dialogue. And so let's see, what's the next thing? So the two other another main thing is this is how I did the interaction prompt. I just get the current interactable. If it is visible and we are not in a dialogue, it'll be set to visible. If there's no current interactable and it is not visible, I just set it to hidden. And the same is, if I remember correctly, no, I do not do that here. This is where it is. The dialog box is set to visible using this is in dialog variable. And finally, I just have the pedestals blueprint here, which has the interact event and the dialog participant event. It works pretty much the same as the non-player characters, and that's basically how I built this system of dialogue and whatnot. If you are wondering what these art assets are, I believe, if I look here, they are the multi-story dungeons that were free on the Epic Marketplace a couple weeks ago. Or longer, I don't remember. But that is what I used to build this dialogue system. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.